Welcome to Casual Friday. I have a finally finished object to show you, a work in progress to show you, a couple of questions to answer, as well as a little segment on socks and sock history. So let's get started. At the end of December, I began working on my first sweater knit from an antique sweater pattern, and I have been calling that the Edwardian sweater. It was a sweater I originally found in the Boston Globe from a January 1906 edition of the paper, and then I found it in a 1904 edition of the Columbia Book of Yarns, and then finally I found it a third time in a 1907 edition of the Columbia Book of Yarns. And so throughout the early part of the year, I was showing you my progress on the sweater, and then I think in April or May, I was pretty much done with it. I just needed to do some button loops on the neck and it would be done. My daughter has laid claim to it, but the weather was getting warmer. She wasn't going to be able to wear it this summer. And so I kind of put it to the side and then worked on my World War I sweater instead, and that is completed. So this week I went back to my Edwardian sweater and decided to complete the bits that still needed to be done. It has what they called in the Edwardian era the pouch. There was short rows of work to create this pouch in the front, and it has this sort of doubled fold back neck right here, and it wasn't clear from the instructions or even the 1907 edition of the Columbia Book of Yarns where I could see one button at the bottom. It's not clear at all how this was supposed to be done. So I decided to create button loops using embroidery floss, and I attached these button loops to a piece of woven binding tape that you would use like for quilting, and put that in between these two layers. So I'm going to do an overhead to show you close up what this looks like and how I did it, as well as a little mini tutorial on how to do these kind of button loops, because I think it's a really neat option for some applications, and in particular this one where I wanted the two edges to come together and I didn't really want them to overlap. So the completed neck of the Edwardian sweater looks like this. I've got two buttons here, and I've created these button loops out of embroidery floss. So let me take this apart, show you what it looks like on the inside, and then I want to show you how I did the button loops. So this is what the button loops look like. They're not attached directly to the knitting because that would cause the knitted stitches to stretch out. What I did was I attached them to this piece of binding, and then I sewed the binding on the inside. And so they're attached right here, and then I used a half stitch mattress seam up the edges, excluding the part where the buttonholes are sticking out in order to close the edges of the collar. But I wanted to show you how these buttonholes are created because I think it's a really neat technique. It's not difficult, but it does take a little bit of practice just to kind of get the hang of it. So I've attached this strand of embroidery floss. This is a regular 6-strand embroidery floss. I've attached it to this piece of binding, and I brought it through the fabric, and I sewed over the tail a few times, and then I brought it up through the crease in this binding. And you don't have to do it up through the crease. You could do it on the back side of it depending on how you wanted it to poke out. I think it probably is a good idea to do this kind of a button loop on a piece of woven fabric so that the button loop isn't going to stretch out the actual knitted fabric, that you sew the woven fabric onto the knitted fabric, and then the button loop is attached to the woven fabric. So the idea here is to create 3 loops of the same size with the embroidery floss. And how you do how big the loops are and how wide apart they are on the woven piece of fabric is going to depend on your buttons and how thick they are or how wide they are, if they're flat, if they're round, and just kind of your own personal choices. I tried a few different sizes of loops with my buttons before I found one that I thought worked well. So my buttons were 7 millimeters, and it turned out that making the loop 7 millimeters worked out really well. So I have a 7 millimeter needle, and I just held it in place here. You could use a finger, you could use whatever you want, something that's going to create this consistent size. And so now I'm going to go back down through the fabric, but I have to decide I'm going to go close to the other one or I'm going to go straight down. And I think it's best to go straight down, but you may find you want to do something else. So I'm going down right in that crease of the fabric, and I'm coming back up where I came out the first time. So I have one loop around the needle. I'm going to go around a second time. Again, I want them the same time. So I've got 2 loops, and now I want a third loop. So I've got these loops all to a consistent size. So now I can take the needle out, the thing that I used to create the space. So I've got these 3 loops. I'm going to come up through the center of those 3 loops. I'm going to keep my finger in here just to keep it from closing up. And now I want to go through this loop. So I want to come under this loop that's attached to the fabric. So I'm creating this basically a half hitch, and I'm going to tighten it. I want to make sure it comes up right next to the fabric here, and I want to pull it tight. Then I come back around again. I'm going to again bring it around my finger so that I can keep track of the loop. So come up through the 3 loops from underneath, and then I'm going to go under this loop, and then I tighten it. So you keep repeating that all the way around, and the little knots are around the outside of the circle. And what I found was that as I tightened them up, the hole maintained the size that I originally made it. It seemed to, for me, at least for these round buttonholes or these round buttons, it worked really well. But you just keep repeating that until you get all the way around to the other edge, and then you poke the thread back through the woven fabric and you tack down the tail again. But it's a really nice way to create a button loop. So the next thing I want to show you is this sock that I'm knitting. Now I'm hosting this August Sock knit along between my YouTube channel and my Ravelry group. The instructions for the knit along are being released in parts, and the first two parts have been released, and those are to help prepare you for the actual casting on and the beginning of the knit along, which begins on August 1st. So things like figuring out your gauge and taking your measurements, figuring out where your fit issues are going to be, that sort of thing. And so as part of the knit along, I wanted to challenge myself because I've knit hundreds of socks. And in many ways, I tend to fall back on the same couple of methods of knitting socks over and over again. So I wanted to try some new things in my socks, and I started early because I wanted to be able to use these socks as demonstrations in the written instructions as variations on what you can do. So the first thing I did was I have this coordinating color that I'm using for the ribbing, the heel, and the toes. And it's by the same company, and it's really meant to go with it, and I'm really liking the result. Often when I use contrast yarn or a coordinating yarn, it's close and it looks okay, but it just doesn't look as great as this particular coordinating yarn looks. Both of the yarns are from West Yorkshire Spinners, WYS, and it's called Signature 4-ply. So there's a self-striping yarn and then the solid color yarn. So I'm using the standard heel stitch for the heel flap, but I'm using an odd number of stitches to make it symmetrical. And I'm also using a little bit of a garter stitch edge just as a decorative element to it. I tried a different heel turn. So on this week's Technique Tuesday, I demonstrated the Dutch heel, which is a type of heel turn. And this coming Tuesday, I'm going to be demonstrating a modified version of the Dutch heel, and it's the modified version that I used for this sock. And it was interesting. I have a very high arch, and so the standard round heel is actually probably the best one for me, and I really wasn't sure if this one was going to fit as well because it gives me about 3/4 of an inch less in the circumference after I return to working in the round. It does fit, it is snug, but it's also summer. My feet are probably swollen a little bit. So the real test will be this winter when my feet are cold and shrunken to see how my socks fit. The heel I used here is called the round heel. Now this is a heel I've heard of in the past, but the wedge heel has always worked fine for me. But I was interested in seeing how the result would differ. This is a type of toe that does not require grafting. Although, because you're down to just a couple of stitches at the end, maybe 8 stitches, and so you can just fasten them off like you would for the crown of a hat. But in my case, I prefer the look of grafting, so even though I only had a couple of stitches, I did graft mine together. I'd seen instructions for this toe in Weldon's Practical Stocking Knitter, which was published in 1885, I believe, maybe 1886. And the first 2 series of the Practical Stocking Knitter are available in reproduction copies from Interweave. I think you can get the hard copy reproduction, but I got mine digital from their website. I'll leave a link down below. It's really an interesting set of instructions. They have 7 or 8 or 9 different heel turns, and then 6, 7 different types of toes. And it can take a little bit of figuring out in some cases what the actual formula is, because in some cases they'll have a specific number of stitches that you need to use, and it's not always clear what that specific number might be. So I'm planning on doing a Technique Tuesday video on the round toe as well. Every week, I ask people if they have any comments or questions or suggestions for videos that they can leave them down in the comments or in my Ravelry group. And so when I see interesting questions or comments or suggestions, I tend to just collect them for a while until I find an opportunity to talk about them. So today, I want to talk, there's two comments or suggestions that I'd like to talk about. The first question is about superwash wool and its suitability for garments. Superwash wool or machine washable wool. Superwash is really a trademarked name. So sometimes you'll see ball bands that will say superwash and sometimes it will say machine washable. And there are really also two different techniques that are used to create superwash or machine washable wool. Wool fiber has scales on it. So when the wool fiber gets wet and then it gets warmer, those scales open up. And then if there's any sort of agitation or rubbing of those fibers together, they will lock. And that's when you get fulling or felting, and you'll see that the wool will shrink and lock and you won't be able to get it back into shape. So what machine washable wool does, the process for creating machine washable wool is to either glue those scales down or to remove those scales using a chemical process. And by removing those scales, it allows the fibers to move back and forth across each other without felting. But it also means that because those scales aren't there, that the wool loses its ability to just go back into shape. Instead, it tends to stretch out over time and get larger and larger. And that problem is exacerbated if you're knitting it at a looser gauge, or sometimes even just the gauge that's listed on the ball band. So my preference is to select the type of yarn for the particular project that I'm knitting and for the recipient. So if I'm knitting for myself, I almost always choose a regular wool. I really like the properties of regular wool. I like how it knits. I like how easy it is to block and keep its shape. I really like everything about it. But there are times when I'm knitting for myself that I am going to use superwash wool. One of those situations is if I'm knitting a scarf. My neck is very sensitive. It doesn't matter how soft or fine that wool is. My neck is probably going to feel itchy unless I'm using a superwash wool. So usually what I end up getting is a merino wool, which is already soft, that is also superwash so that it's as soft as it can be and as most comfortable as it can be around my neck. I'll also use superwash wool when I'm knitting hats, and I will tend to knit those hats at a firmer gauge so that they don't stretch out and slide down over my eyes. So it's that knitting to a firmer gauge that I find helps the wool hold its shape better, particularly if you're knitting something like a sweater for an adult. I do sometimes use superwash wool, 100% superwash wool for sweaters, for babies or small children. Those tend to be very special gifts, and I just cross my fingers and hope that the recipient, the mother or father of the recipient, listens to my advice on how to care for it, but it's out of my hands. For small children, I tend to use or prefer to use a blend that's a synthetic machine washable wool blend, so that it has some of the characteristics of wool in terms of how warm it is, but that it also has the ease of care. Because if you are putting something on a baby that's spitting up all the time, and you have to wash the item frequently, then you might as well make it something that can be thrown in the wash. The thing that I use superwash wool most often for is sock knitting. And the sock yarn I tend to select is a combination of superwash wool and nylon. And the nylon is for durability and the superwash wool is for practicality. Because socks have to be washed way more frequently than a sweater has to be. You don't have to wash socks every time you wear them. That's the beauty of wool socks, is they don't tend to stink. You can give them a rest for a day and then wear them again. And they may stretch out because of that superwash, but as soon as you throw them back in the washing machine, they usually regain their shape. I don't tend to put my superwash socks in the dryer. Maybe once or twice a season I'll do that. Usually I wash them with my underwear and bras, and as I'm taking those things out, I evaluate each thing that's coming out of that load of wash. Does it hang on the wooden lingerie rack, or can I actually throw it in the dryer? So for socks, most of the time I will hang them on the lingerie rack, and once or twice a winter I'll throw them in the dryer. And the main reason that I don't throw them in the dryer every time is because I feel like they acquire a lot more lint when they're tumbling in a dryer with other clothes. So they tend to look better longer if I let them dry on the rack. And then once or twice a winter, if they feel like they're stretching out too much, then they do go in the dryer, and then they'll shrink back to shape. The next topic suggestion that was made came in a couple of months ago, and it was from someone who had just recently had to rechart a pattern. I don't know if it was something that was in a book, and so it wasn't easy to see the chart, and so she decided to rechart it on graph paper. I'm not sure exactly the circumstances. But what she discovered was the process of charting out the pattern ahead of time made her understand the stitch pattern a lot sooner than if she'd waited until she started knitting. That's one of the big advantages I find when I'm charting out a pattern ahead of time, when I'm recharting it, is I can chart out more repeats, more multiples of it, so I can see how it actually works in the big picture. I can see how it's going to lay out in terms of the shape of the garment. I can see where I'm going to have to do shaping and how that might encroach in on the pattern, or how I might have to add in, repeats of the pattern, how I might approach that. So it really gives me a big picture of the whole thing, but it does give me this feeling of sort of pre-knitting the stitch pattern. And I see how many stitches apart, like a yarn over might be from a decrease, or which decreases are being used, or how those yarn overs move across the fabric from one row to another, or how those cables are crossing and intertwining with each other. And it just gives me a sense of what's really going on before I start knitting. And I still might have to look at the chart. I probably or definitely will have to look at the chart when I'm first knitting it, but I will just be so much more comfortable with it than I would be if I was starting my project and not having really any experience with the chart at all. So there are a bunch of different ways that you can chart patterns, and some of it depends on the kind of stitch pattern you're using. So for things like color work, or even basic lace patterns where you're working single decreases and just yarn overs, you can use a spreadsheet to chart those kinds of patterns out. Or you can use graph paper. You can print out graph paper from online. You can decide how big you want your squares, and you can just do it with pencil and paper. You can tape those sheets together so you can get your big picture sense of how something is going to turn out as well. Or you can use charting software, and the charting software I use is called Stitch Mastery, and I really like it a lot. And one of the reasons I really like it is because of how extensive the stitch pattern library is, particularly for cables. With Stitch Mastery, you also have the ability to customize symbols as well if you have something that's really unusual that you want to combine. So the woman who created, her name is Kathy, I think her last name is Scott, and she has a group on Ravelry for Stitch Mastery. She's very responsive. Her customer service is excellent. You can download a demo of it if you want to try it out first. It's not the only option out there. There are other options out there, but it's reasonably priced. You can get a free demo. There's great customer support. So that's the one I use. But again, you can use graph paper and a pen and pencil, or you can use an Excel spreadsheet. There's lots of ways you can chart it, but there really are some great benefits to recharting your charts for your project. There's a family legend, parable type of story that has various variations on it, and I don't know if it's known outside the United States or if people in all cultures have a similar story. But the way the story goes is a young bride is making a big dinner for the first time. It's a dinner that she watched her mother make her whole life, and And so she goes to the store and she buys a pot roast. She brings it home, and as she's preparing to put it in the oven, she cuts the end of the pot roast off, puts it in the roasting pan, and then puts it in the oven. And somebody who's watching her, her husband or a friend or somebody like that, asks her why she cut the end of the pot roast off. And she said, well, that's the way my mother always did it. And the person says, but why? She's like, well, I don't know. That's just the way you do it. So she calls her mom. She said, Mom, why do you cut the end off the pot roast? And she said, I don't know. That's just the way my mother always did it. That's how I learned it. And so Grandma's still alive. So they call up Grandma and they say, Grandma, why did you always cut the end off the pot roast before you put it in the oven? And she'd say, oh, well, because the roasting pan I had was too small. Generations had been following this practice of cutting the end off the pot roast without knowing why. And the context in which it was originally done has been lost, and yet the practice was still followed. In knitting, this happens a lot. Knitting has been around for generations, and as knitting has evolved, things that we do commonly, things that are common practice in knitting, have changed, and yet sometimes we hold on to these routines or these rules or these practices without understanding why we're doing them. And then we end up in situations where we continue to follow the rule, but it actually doesn't make sense. But because we don't know the reason for the rule to begin with, we don't know what we're doing is wrong in this particular situation. So let me give you some examples. In contemporary knitting, the advice that we usually give to knitters is that when you are working flat in rows, if the edges are going to remain exposed, like if you're knitting a scarf or a blanket or a shawl or something like that, then you can get a nice edge. It's a nice practice to slip the first stitch of every row. But if you're going to be picking up stitches, or if you're going to be seaming, then we say don't slip the stitches because you're going to run into some problems. The most typical method of seaming these days is to use a technique called mattress stitch. And with mattress stitch, if you have slipped your selvage stitches, those slipped selvage stitches are going to create tension issues in the adjacent stitches, and those stitches are going to remain viewable after the seam is done. And so if you just knit those selvage stitches plain in stockinette or something like that, then you'll get a much neater finished seam. And likewise, if you are planning on picking up stitches later, it's better to leave those selvage stitches plain rather than slipped. And the reason is when you pick up stitches along a vertical edge, the number of stitches that you need is typically about 2/3 to 3/4 of the number of rows that you have. And that's because there's more rows per inch than stitches per inch. So for example, let's say your gauge is 5 stitches and 7 rows per inch, and you have a 10-inch long vertical edge. That would be 70 rows. But if you want to pick up along the edge and in order to knit fabric coming out in that direction, you are going to be working stitches along that edge, and 10 inches of stitches is 50. So you need to pick up 50 stitches along those 70 rows. But if you had slipped the first stitch of every row, you would only have 35 selvage stitches, and you need to get 50. So you wouldn't have enough selvage stitches to pick up the number of stitches you need. So that's why we advise knitters today to always work those edges that are not going to remain exposed. But there are a lot of knitters today who were taught by older family members to always slip that first stitch of every row when they're knitting flat. And so then they run into problems when they're trying to seam or pick up stitches because that was the rule that they were taught. They weren't taught why, they were just taught that that's the rule. So I had always question this, like, why would that have even been taught to anybody? I mean, if it's common practice to not do that when the edges are not going to be exposed, why would some people teach other people that you should always slip the first stitch? I didn't know. As I've been knitting my antique sweater patterns, I began to be curious about how they would seam their garments back then, because I didn't see any instruction about it. And as I looked in the actual knitting manuals of the time, there were no instructions about how to do the seaming. These were books on practical needlework. So there was information on seaming when it came to things like making shirts or making dresses or things like that, and they would have information on how you worked your stitches. So I began to realize that there wasn't a difference in how they were seaming their sweaters. So in the late 19th century, these knitting manuals and knitting patterns often did state to slip the first stitch of every row when knitting flat. But that's probably because they were using backstitch to seam. And backstitch is a bulky seam. A slipped selvage stitch is going to have less bulk, and those longer selvage stitches are going to be a nice guide for inserting the needle and making a neat seam. So in that context, it made a lot of sense. Once I understood how they were likely seaming their knitted items, then I could understand the reason for slipping the first stitch of every row. When it comes to knitting socks with heel flaps and gussets, there are also some sort of rules of thumb and common practices that are used that in some cases haven't made sense to me. But again, as I've been going back through time looking at these old sock and stocking patterns and seeing the formulas that they used and the procedures that they used prior to World War I, then things started to make sense. So this is a sock with a heel flap and gusset. So the blue part is the leg, and that's knit in the round. And then when you get to this point, the sock leg ends. And that's when the heel flap needs to be worked. And that's this pink part right here. And so the heel flap, the formula is to knit it using half of the stitches of the sock. And then for the length, there are a couple of different approaches. A really common one is to knit the heel flap for as many rows as you are using stitches for the heel. So if you have a 64 stitch sock and you have a 32 stitch heel flap, then you would work it for 32 rows. But another approach is to knit the heel flap until it's square, so it's just as long as it is wide. That's another approach. And then the third approach that is often given as advice today is to knit the heel flap to the length of the recipient. So in addition to these three approaches to how long the heel flap should be knit, there are two other things that are done in all cases. One is that you slip the first stitch of every row when you're knitting a heel flap. And then the second thing is that once your heel flap is done, and then the turn is done, that's the purple part here, then you want to resume working in the round. And so in order to get this yellow part that's worked in the round, you have to connect the blue part up here to the purple part down there. So the blue and the purple are all live stitches, but the pink is a vertical edge, and so that's where you pick up stitches, and then you're going to be knitting perpendicularly to the flap. So the rule is you're slipping the first stitch of every row of the heel flap, and then when you go to pick up stitches, you pick up one stitch for every slipped selvage stitch. So let's look at these approaches and these practices and see how they work. Well, this is heel stitch. This is the stitch pattern that's commonly used in socks today. But before World War I, the heel flaps were invariably knit in stockinette. They were not knit with a different sort of stitch pattern. So let's take a look at a stockinette flap knit with these rules versus a heel stitch flap worked with these rules. So this is a heel flap that is 32 stitches wide and it is 32 rows long. And I have slipped the selvage for every row. So I have 16 selvage stitches along the edge of each one of these. And this is a heel flap that was knit with heel stitch. Use the same number of stitches. I used the same needles. So you can see that this one is smaller. I can lay it on top of there. You can see that it is narrower and it is shallower. So 32 stitches wide, 32 rows deep, 32 stitches wide, 32 rows deep. both have 16 selvage stitches along the edge. So remember when I talked about when you're picking up stitches along a vertical edge, you want the fabric that the stitches that you're picking up to be the same width as that vertical edge is long. So with heel stitch, when you pick up those 16 stitches, you actually end up with something that is just as wide. This row gauge is so condensed that when you pick up one stitch for every slip selvage, the fabric that you create along the edge is exactly the right width. But if you pick up that many stitches on the edge of a stockinette flap, the stitches that you pick up are going to have to stretch really wide in order to span this much, and they probably aren't going to stretch wide enough, and instead the fabric is going to collapse a little bit and bulge out a little bit in the middle, and so it's not going to be a good match. On the one hand, knitting 32 rows gives a nice length for a heel flap, but it gives a lousy pickup ratio for knitting the gussets. But this has a really nice ratio for picking up, even though the heel flap is too short. So if you knit this heel flap to the correct length, you can pick up however many selvage stitches there are, and that fabric will be exactly the right width that it needs to be. So for this kind of flap, it really makes sense to knit it to the length of the recipient. Now this is also one where, because it's narrower, you could knit it square and it would probably fit more people, certainly than this shallow heel would fit. If you were to knit this flap square, it would be 4 inches wide and 4 inches long. It would be even longer than it is now. It would be way too long. So knitting this square would be inappropriate. So the best thing to do is to, if you're going to slip your selvage stitches, you have to pick up more stitches than what you have here along your selvage. And that's where looking at these old Victorian stocking patterns kind of sheds some light on these practices of how we are knitting socks today and the context that we have lost. So what I discovered in reading Victorian stocking patterns is that they knit their stockings by proportion. Whatever cast on number they started with at the top of the thigh, they expected to have 3/4 of that number of stitches around the ankle. And when they were done with the heel and they were picking up stitches, they wanted a specific number of stitches on the needle after they picked up for the gusset. And that number was maybe 8 or 10 stitches less than whatever they had cast on for the thigh. So they were working with this idea of proportion. So when they were picking up stitches after they had finished turning the heel, they would pick up the number of stitches that they needed in order to get that expected proportional number. So if your heel turn gave you more stitches, then you would pick up fewer stitches along the flap. If your heel turn gave you no stitches, then you would pick up more stitches along the flap. And they were always looking at this specific proportion, which may or may not have worked for a specific individual, but that's the formula that they were working from. It was no problem for them if they had an edge with slipped selvage stitches to pick up more stitches than they had along the selvage. They would just pick up extra stitches. That was all part of it. What was even more interesting to me, though, was to come upon the stocking pattern that was published in the first knitting book written in English, and it was published in it was either 1817 or 1819. I've seen two different dates, but it was one of those booklets that was produced by the British government for these national schools, these schools of industry, to teach girls how to knit. And so they had these little formulas or recipes for knitting socks depending on how many stitches they had cast on. And they were different than these very specific proportional formulas that you saw later at the end of the century. And in this case, those heel flaps did not have slipped stitches, and they picked up at the same ratio that you would pick up along any stockinette edge for any other garment today. That is, they would pick up 2 stitches for every 3 rows. So at some point in the 19th century, it was decided that slipping the first stitch of every row was something that was a best practice. But if you needed more stitches than what you had along a slipped selvage, then you would just pick up more stitches. And that context has been lost to us. And especially as we've shifted from a stockinette flap to this heel stitch flap, some of the formulas that made sense and that were used long ago are still applied to a situation where it doesn't necessarily make any sense. So what does all of this mean? Well, what it means is that when you hear a rule for something in knitting, it's always a good idea to ask why. And if the person who's told you the rule doesn't know the reason, they might just be cutting off the end of the pot roast because that's the way their mother always did it. So keep looking, keep asking, and try to figure out why a rule is a rule or why a practice is a practice, and then whether or not it makes any sense in your own knitting. Well, that's it for this week's Casual Friday. If you have any comments or questions about today's video or suggestions for videos you'd like to see in the future, you can leave those down in the comments below or join the discussion in my Ravelry group, Rocks. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next week.